Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360-degree feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 100 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level, from board chair to first-line supervisor. Dr. Rose has worked with Fortune 50 multinational companies such as Google and Home Depot, top-tier universities including Stanford University and the Wharton School of Business, and non-governmental agencies such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals, and his book, Hire Better Teachers Now, was recently released by Harvard Education Press. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rose.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks you all for joining me today. Look forward to exploring one of my favorite topics on leadership coaching. Sharing some perspectives, particularly on when coaching is a good idea and when it might not be a good idea. This presentation actually comes out of a conversation that I had with a group of our 3D group coaches. We were sitting around chatting about our experiences and sort of sharing war stories, if you will, and we started to see some themes around some of the engagements that we were in, where we were finding some greater success in some situations and less success in others, and we were thinking there are some themes here in terms of where coaching is most successful and where it is less successful. And one of the things that we found, as we'll explore, is that some of the most important elements of it had to do with sort of how the coaching was set up, sort of how it started and whatnot. So we're going to kind of explore some of those areas in which coaching is more effective and some where maybe it's a little bit less effective, and what some of the issues might be there. So briefly, a little bit about our organization, 3D Group. We've been in business now for over 20 years, almost 22 years, I believe. And we focus on 3 core practice areas. So we do a lot of 360-degree feedback, both custom and off-the-shelf. As Jesse mentioned, those engagements frequently include some sort of a coaching component after the feedback is collected. We also do employee surveys, employee engagement surveys, custom surveys. And then each of those practice areas often feed our leadership development work, wherein we're doing more kind of long-term leadership coaching. We also do leadership workshops and a variety of sort of leadership development, sort of intensive leadership development experiences, always tailored to each individual client. When we look at kind of what makes us perhaps unique, certainly in the coaching world, we have a very strong belief in the value of behavioral science. There's a huge body of research out there about what works best in terms of how to observe, collect, and report on individual workplace behavior, and then also how to help modify and improve workplace behavior at the individual and the group level. So really being able to pin all of our work back to that science is quite important for us. We also work with a very wide range of organizations, so we do not specialize in a particular type of company. We don't specialize in healthcare or technology or any of that. We find that by having a diverse client base, it keeps us very honest to making sure that what we deliver fits that organization. So we always come in with our ears wide open, trying very much to fit what we're doing to what's going to be most effective in that particular situation. And when we talk to our clients about what characterizes us, what makes us different or unique, or what do they value about the work that we do with them, we find consistently the word flexibility comes to describe our work. And that flexibility, I think, is very much born from that ears first orientation of trying to figure out what's going to work best for this situation and have as many tools as we can to adapt our solution to fit that situation. So anyway, it's a little bit about us. Thought it might be useful to look at a little bit about our clients, and not just kind of here's this big long list of clients, but a little bit more specificity. So the group here you see in the core, this is a group of clients that we work with on a long-term coaching basis. Long-term for us is typically around 6 months. So as you'll see later, we feel that 6 months is a good amount of time for a leader to kind of dig in deep, but then not become sort of dependent on a coach. So most of those are are kind of 6-month engagements that we may come back to, but that's a typical focus. And then there's a whole other group of folks that we work with that are more sort of short-term focused individual coaching around a group of assessments, sort of targeted short-term coaching that tends to be assessment-based. As you can see, lots of different shapes and sizes of companies. So again, focusing on that core, what works best with people, and then how do we fit it to that situation is kind of our orientation. So let's start by just asking the question, what is coaching? You hear coaching, the term thrown around a lot in terms of very popular practice these days. Interestingly, if you start looking into it, you hear all kinds of, coaching can be all kinds of things. Someone says, oh, I've got a coach. Well, what does that mean? Is that a life coach? Is that someone who's a counselor? Is that maybe even a therapist? So the term coaching has been thrown around quite a bit. We like to think about coaching in a very specific way. We like to think about coaches as being focused on workplace behavior, and in particular examining kind of current organizational challenges. So it's very much in the context of an organization, what is going on here, and how can we help a leader reflect on their past actions, explore future possibilities, and then think about them in light of their intention. One of the things we run into in coaching all the time is that people are behaving and doing things within their organization, but not necessarily getting the results they want. So a lot of coaching is around, what is it that you're trying to achieve here, and let's see how we can help you figure out how to achieve that goal. Sometimes it's a matter of helping them first be clear about what their intention is. So I think this notion of focusing on the workplace, examining organizational dynamics, and then reflecting is part of what makes it a unique learning experience. Very different than, say, a training program where you sit and there's a specific curriculum you go through. The curriculum in a coaching engagement is really designed around the environment, and it's constantly moving and changing. So you may work with an individual one day on a particular topic that's lined up with previous conversations. The next session you may meet with them and they may have something completely different that they need to deal with. And if you stay on that kind of rigid curriculum, you're going to end up leaving them not getting what they need in terms of their current environment. So being very current is important. Well, what it looks like and how it's shaped can be also quite varied. So when you look at and think about what does a coach do? What are their kind of behaviors? How do they do that? You see a pretty big range. So, in its pure essence, I would say coaching is really about someone helping a leader to learn, helping a leader learn in their environment how to be more effective. But that can look like a lot of different things. Sometimes it's, giving someone a helping hand, getting them over that last little bit. Sometimes it's just really encouraging them, giving them that confidence that they can leverage those skills that they know are strengths to do the job and get it done in the way they intend. So encouragement can be a great tool for coaches. Sometimes it's more like tough love. Sometimes somebody's kind of doubting themselves, holding themselves back, and it's pushing them further than they know they could do. And then sometimes it's more sort of a collaborative, brainstorm, engaging kind of conversation, really inspiring, exploring a topic. And really a coach in some ways needs to be able to do all of these, again, based on how that environment shifts and changes with the particular leader in the particular situation. Has to do with the individual as well. Certainly this football coach here, certain individuals would not succeed with that. Other individuals would succeed very well, and in fact some leaders need that kind of direct, focused, here, let me tell you what the situation is, pay attention. They can be, leaders particularly at higher levels can be very, well actually all levels, can be very, very stubborn and strong-minded. So you need as a coach to be able to move between these different situations and different styles, recognize your own style, but also recognize that a certain style and a certain approach may be needed for a particular situation. So one of the interesting things about coaching is it's got an incredible increase in popularity. There was a study put out recently that found that over 46,000 companies are providing coaching. When I was first reading it, I was sure it was going to say we're hiring coaches, but 46,000 are providing coaches in some way, shape, or form. And I believe this was back in, '08. there was a growth curve of over 18%. May have slowed down a little bit, but still very much a growth industry. A study done recently by the Stanford School of Business found that looked at about 200 companies, asking them, particularly the CEOs, directors, executives, what's going on with coaching in your company. Found that well over half of the organizations that were using coaching indicated that they were using more of it than they had in the past. And so there's a real strong push in the direction of doing more of this. So one asks the question, why? Why is coaching all of a sudden so popular? Well, there's a few reasons at least. The first, I think, is important to note, put ourselves in historical context a little bit. Historically, organizations are not that old. They've really only been around maybe a couple hundred years in the way that we know them now. And today, if you look at organizations, even just going back 2-3 decades, frankly, organizations today are far more complex than they ever were in the past. They simply have more elements to them. You've got matrixed organizations. You've got people managing across the globe in different time zones. You've got people. So the complexity of what we're dealing with is just incredibly different than it was even 20 years ago. The sheer volume of information. One can look at leadership or management science as sort of information management, right? Decision making with limited information. So when information is exponentially more than it was in the past, it's much more difficult for a leader to succeed, and they're going to need extra support. They're going to need that extra, thought partner to help them work through that level of complexity and make sure that given that that level of complexity, they're processing the right information, focusing on the right things. The other thing to recognize is the pace of work is far different than it ever has been. The 24-hour news cycle we're familiar with, but really we're onto a 24-hour work cycle if you look at, again, the globalization, but also just the expectations. It's a very rare executive that does not expect to get and respond to emails on their weekends, in the evenings. It's just become part of our kind of daily life, and so recognizing that when the pace is that quick, it's going to require a lot more assistance. So basically, the job of being a leader in a modern organization has gotten a lot more complex. It's moving a lot quicker, and so as a consequence, leaders need to be able to process and deal with more information more quickly. The other thing is that leaders, I think, are more and more realizing that because of also part of that complexity, that it's very difficult to learn from your environment in a book, right? It's very difficult to sort of open up a book, read through, go down to the bookstore. I hope you do. Certainly online is easier, but go down to that bookstore. You'll see huge section of management books. You could read every one of those books, and it's not necessarily going to make you a better leader in real time. So the notion is that with a coach, you can get specific real-time feedback. You can say, hey, here's this problem I'm working on as of yesterday. How do I think about this? How do I do? You can't get that in a book. So it's a very unique way of learning live and in the moment based on real-time circumstances. And then last, I think this is a really important one. Often people think, well, isn't that what your manager is for? Shouldn't your manager be there to help you sort of work through and think through some challenges? Well, your boss can't help you with everything. There's plenty of things that are going to be very difficult for someone to work with unless they have a pretty exceptional boss. For one thing, just the third-party perspective, having a coach that's from the outside that can say, well, have you thought of this? They can bring up things that might be that third rail within the organization, but it might be the very thing that needs to be addressed. So it's very difficult when you're in a system to reflect on the system. A coach coming from the outside can do that. The other thing is that you can't, as a coach, one of the things when you work with leaders is they will throw out sort of experimental ideas, right? They'll say, well, what if we tried this? Or my first reaction was to do X, but boy, that seems kind of crazy. And it's certainly not something they would ever bring up to their boss. It's too risky. But with a coach, you can explore those ideas that are kind of out on those fringes that might seem sort of crazy from the inside, but then turn out to be incredible innovations. So it's a really freeing space for a leader to explore and learn in an area that they might not otherwise really be able to explore at all. So I think for all these reasons, coaching has become a very, very powerful tool in the modern organization. And when done well with the right kind of focus on goals and purpose, it can be a very, very powerful outcome. And I know we had some questions from some of the attendees early on. I appreciate those, and we'll get to some of those in the end that address this question of the value of coaching. But I think embedded in there, you're going to find a lot of your answers on this slide in terms of these four key elements. Well, I thought it would be interesting, and I certainly have my own experiences, and the coaches, the 3D group coaches that we're all sort of talking about this, have our own experiences about kind of what leaders actually need coaching on. What are they getting coaching on? What are those conversations about? We have our own kind of experience there, but always good to look at some research. So again, back to that Stanford study, one of the questions they asked leaders in those 200 companies is, what kind of coaching are you getting? What are the kinds of things that you need coaching on? And you can see here that a lot of the things that they list, one of the interesting things is there wasn't anything over 100%. These are the strongest findings there. So part of this tells me right away that coaching is fairly idiosyncratic. There isn't a huge trend. A lot of this is interpersonal, so there's definitely an interpersonal component to it, and certainly the conflict management is emerging as the most popular, but there's still a huge chunk out there that isn't about that. So what this says is that that coaching is a lot about how to interact effectively with others, but it's also very specific to each individual. You can't say, oh yeah, that person's getting coaching, it's probably because they're not working well with others. Well, what about the 57% that's not about that? So so idiosyncratic, but primarily focused on interpersonal issues. That tends to be the bigger issue. And again, in my experience and with our coaches, these tend to be around how do I effectively interact with individuals to get us going where we're going from a business perspective. So it's not conflict management, couldn't there just be peace? It's more like conflict management so that we can get our team aligned, moving in the right direction. We're all kind of pushing in different directions, different agendas. How do we pull those together, and how do I as a leader get everyone on the same page? So I think that's really where I think about the kind of content of coaching. One of the interesting kind of key dimensions, and this is really what prompted a lot of our discussion, was the basic differentiation. When you look at different kinds of coaching, you can kind of see two different styles, and really what you want to do is to try to bridge the gap where you can. But one of the first things, and I know there'll be a couple coaches on this call too, one of the first things you've got to find out when you walk into a coaching engagement is this a remedial situation? Is this a situation where they are trying to sort of save somebody? Or is this much more of high-performance coaching? And when you're approaching a coaching engagement from one of these two places, it's a very radically different dynamic, not just in terms of what you're doing with the individual, but also what you're doing with the system, with the organization, how you're reporting back to the manager, how you relate to HR, what expectations might be, time horizons, motivations, huge difference. So one of the core dimensions that you've really got to think about is you're looking at any coaching engagement is it remedial or is it high performance? And frankly, you can also look at a coaching program from this perspective. Are we trying to do high performance coaching with our high potentials, or are we trying to really bring up those people that we're trying to quote unquote save? And being clear about this up front is very important. I think this is one of the things that we really all agreed on, is that if you go in being told that it's a high performance situation and then you find out it's remedial, that's problematic. Or if you go in thinking it's being remedial and then the person you're coaching thinks it's a high-performance coaching engagement, that can cause some real problems as well. So being clear about this up front is critical. Well, so this is kind of a core split, but we came up with 5 key areas that I think we face most frequently. And what I'd like to do is to kind of go through each of these and talk about within them, when do you want to really be careful about maybe coaching isn't the right thing, and then on the other side, which of these situations are really optimal where coaching can make the biggest difference. So let's look at each of them. The first is career transitions, places where typically is going to be a promotion or moving into a new industry, that kind of thing. Interpersonal roadblocks, occasionally you've got someone who's really, really effective, but they're not a very good listener. They tend to sort of push out their point of view, or maybe they listen to a particular group more than another group. They may have particular individuals on their team that they just can't work well with, and how do they get through that, that sort of thing. Knowledge gaps show up sometimes, so somebody will have a particular knowledge set that they'll need. Change management is a big one, where someone will come in and they need to do some change management within the organization. They've never done that before, so how do they do that? What are the steps? What are the processes? The dysfunctional team. So this is where we start to get into one of those kind of, maybe coaching is not the right situation or right approach in this situation. There are circumstances where it may be, but you've got to be real cautious when the team is not as functional. And then there's the kind of ultimate remedial coaching situation, the lost cause, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But sort of coaching is the last-ditch effort to try to save them. So what I would say is the first two here are really clear opportunities where coaching can make a huge difference. Knowledge gaps, kind of here and there. And then with the last two, it can be effective, but you've got to be very cautious. So let's drill into each one of those in a little bit more detail. So the first challenge that we face or see leaders facing has to do with career transition. So the first set of those are things like leveling up. Maybe I'm in a new business unit, new culture, leading one's former peers, really common. Someone gets that promotion, but now all of a sudden they can't go out on the outing Friday evening that all the people are going out on because they are the leader, and it doesn't work that way. So one of the experiences I've had in this, so just to give some kind of examples and some flavor, and of course I won't name names or any of that, but one of the experiences that we talked about was around leveling up. So I worked with a particular leader who actually had gone through 3 promotions in the course of 2 years, and they were fairly significant promotions, and the very last one was quite large. She went from leading like 7 people to then leading managers to then leading a group of 80 with multiple different functions and complex different clients. And she's a very talented leader, very talented, but again, that shift in a 2-year period from 8 to 80, big shift. She was capable of it, but she needed support. And so here's an example where I worked with her individually, very closely. On the first thing we did was to say, okay, what are the rules of the game, right? So when you make a transition like this, you've got to first stop and ask the question, what are the rules of the game? It's completely different. What used to work before does not work now. What used to be a perfectly good email to send is going to get you in a lot of trouble now. So how have things changed? What is your environment like? And again, you can see this is not the kind of thing that you can just read in a book. You need someone who, in this case, I'd worked with the organization for about 8 years, so I knew the organization pretty well, and I could help her to really learn kind of what the level, that level difference was. But it worked. We had to work very hard on really understanding what is completely different here and what are the rules, what works well, what doesn't. And I think having someone that she could, she was walking into meetings and having experiences where she was perceived completely differently by the exact same people simply because she had a different title, completely surprised her. She had no idea why. So we spent a lot of time talking through sort of what does positional power mean and how does that show up. And she'd experienced it a little bit in her career before, but never to that degree. So again, just being able to have someone reflect on what the game has changed, how the game has changed in her particular situation was incredibly valuable. And now she's actually on par to be promoted again 2 years later. It's an organization experiencing quite a bit of growth. So anyway, these are some examples where I think coaching can have a huge positive effect. Maybe the best effect are in these kinds of situations. In a career transition issue that's kind of going the other way, you do have to be a little cautious. So there are a couple of cautions there. So occasionally we will see in this sort of zone somebody as a high potential being retained as we're getting coaching as a perk. And if that's being done but not in a really authentic way, in other words, if the leader themselves just feels like, oh, this is a prize, I get to talk to my coach, but they're not invested in it, they're not coming asking those questions because they're wearing coaching more as a badge than using it as a tool, that can be really problematic. And then the flip side, preparing for a new role actually can be good, but you've got to be cautious that that's not too long, right? So it's not like let's give them a coach for 6 months and see if they get up to this level, and then maybe they'll move forward. That's a little bit of a setup. You want to be able to make the decision on the basis of unless it's a really specific skill. If they could just get this one thing, they're there, then that can work. But if it's more broadly, well, gee, it'd be great if they could step up. Let's just give them a coach and hope they magically get better, and then we can promote them. That's not going to work. The preparation for a new role that does work is more where it's like, okay, let's give them, say, 4 to 6 weeks of planning. Again, they start hitting the ground running, knowing what those new rule changes are, if you will, in the 4 to 6 weeks before a new assignment. So these are spaces where I would say leadership coaching can have a really incredibly positive impact. I think these are places where if you're looking at this for leaders, this is a great opportunity. The next one is interpersonal roadblocks. They show up in all kinds of situations. It can look like, as you can see here, one of my favorite is kind of adding too much value. I've got to get in and do everything. I was actually just working with someone yesterday who just, literally at the CEO level, but is treating her direct reports as like frontline managers and as extensions of herself, and not giving them the kind of empowerment to kind of do their own work and own their own zones. And it's interesting because this is a woman that's at a C-level at a national organization and is still dealing with an issue that many first-time managers deal with around just wanting to get in and be in the weeds to sort of have an effect, but she will not succeed if she continues in that zone. So trying to get her to see some of those things is critical. One of my favorite stories on this was when we had one of our coaches was talking about a client she had, and it was a C-level person who came in, and the client was just saying, well, this is great. My predecessor was no good at running the organization. He spent all his time just focusing on the board, never tried to run the business at all, and I'm just sure we've got board meetings every quarter. I'll make sure they go well, but the board is not the point. I've got to run the organization. And here was an example where it was just a horrible misread of the political dynamic, and that leader really needed to hear that was not going to work. Now, that the coach was saying about how that doesn't necessarily happen on the first day. You don't say, oh, no, that's not going to work. You've got to focus on the board too and do a lot more than you think. Our coach kind of started with that approach, but it took a little bit of time. It actually took 2 board meetings for the CEO to come back to the coach and literally say, okay, you told me so, I get it, you're right, now how do I deal with this board thing? So there again is sort of that changing rules, but there was an interpersonal aspect to it where that CEO just didn't feel like they needed to do that, focus on the board. They needed to focus somewhere else. The other example here is the leader that's just ignoring input from others. I've got the best ideas. And again, here's that example where being able to not go to your boss and talk about this issue is really, really important. You need a coach who can say, hey, maybe you need to listen to others. This is where, for example, a 360 becomes really valuable because you're going to get that feedback, but then the process itself is the act of how do we work on not ignoring feedback from others. So these interpersonal roadblocks tend to be pretty idiosyncratic to individuals, very focused on their individual situation, and I don't know a single book that could remotely do justice, or even a training course, really, to any one of these situations in terms of the impact that you can have with an individual in dealing with some of these interpersonal spaces. So, all right, let's look at the third one, knowledge gap. So this is a little bit more unique, a little bit more rare, but it does show up. So these are situations where the the leader does not have a specific set of knowledge that the coach does, and the coach is literally, showing them how to do something or giving them almost a curriculum. It's a very tailored curriculum around here's how to do this. So, for example, as I mentioned, kind of change management. Someone who doesn't really know what are the kind of core principles of change management and how do they apply to this specific situation. Very different than being an OD consultant trying to implement change management, but just educating a leader about what to expect in change management would be an example. Another one would be, say, presentation skills. I remember working with one leader once who talked really fast and could never talk really slow and just really talked fast like this all the time, even when they were doing presentations. And we literally had to work on, techniques for how to slow her down, get her to focus, be clear, her brain was just so far ahead of what she was trying to say. And so just those specialized skills, all kinds of different skills that can show up here. This, I think, is a space where a coach can be very effective if they have that specific skill set. So you want to be really careful that the coach that you hire for a knowledge gap kind of bridging exercise is really an expert in that space. So for example, you would not want to hire me to coach somebody on how to read financial reports and find cost savings. That's not really going to be my purview, or frankly, I don't think any of our purviews at 3D Group. But again, looking for a fit. What are those specific knowledge gaps that I've got on this particular situation is going to be the key differentiator for success and failure. Now, this is an interesting one, the dysfunctional team. This one shows up quite a bit. We had a good conversation, rich opportunities here in terms of the leadership team or the executive team often not being functional. And what do see, we will often get a call that, hey, this executive team isn't working. Can you coach the leader to be more effective in making that team work? And yes, to some degree, as we see here, the leader's responsibility is to make that team functional, but that's not all of the answer. So you have to be really thoughtful. If you look at sort of the 5 dysfunctions of a team, if you will, there are issues in here that the leader can clearly have a positive impact on. But if there's a lack of commitment from the executives, that's going to be a problem. And sure, the leader can do a few things, but if the issue is the individuals themselves, their own histories, maybe they're, maybe half the team or maybe more of the team. Actually, I do have one client right now where literally the entire executive team are all retirement ready and could leave at any time and are just there because they kind of enjoy it. They do have occasionally some attention and focus issues. These are not necessarily the responsibility of the leader. Again, perhaps the leader can make changes to the team to understand what's going on in the team first and then make changes within the team to make it be more effective. But you've got to be cautious about assuming that coaching the leader is necessarily going to work. It may be that you need to actually bring someone in to do a team intervention, and whereas those two do interface, make sure that you're putting the right intervention at the right target. Even again, a good example, fear of conflict, right? In theory, the leader can set the tone on that, but there are plenty of individuals who have a fear of conflict all by themselves. You can have a perfectly open leader who's encouraging collaboration and debate and disagreement and discussion, and there can be 3 people who are just like, I just can't stand any kind of disagreement. I personally can't deal with that. That's going to create a team dynamic that the leader themselves is not necessarily responsible for. So again, there's an interface here, but be cautious if the team is not working to assume that the leader is the issue and the leader needs to be get coaching and whatnot. A coach can help, I think, but not always necessarily the right solution. The one that showed up perhaps the most when we were thinking, well, what are those situations where coaching is just, can be just really problematic? And not always, but can be really problematic. And this is the one that I think most of us agreed were really challenging, that lost cause. So when when a coach gets hired to come in to confirm an existing negative evaluation, right? If the CEO hires us to come in and they've already decided. I had one client that did this to me 4 years ago maybe, where they said, I am almost 100% sure that I want to get rid of my CFO, but I'd like you to coach him for 6 months, and we'll see if he can get better. The decision had already been made. This was clearly a matter of just confirming the CEO's assumptions, and so that can be really problematic. There's a situation where if you, as a coach, if you find yourself being asked to do something like that, or you recognize that that is really the subtle hint here, not necessarily going to have a successful coaching outcome from the perspective of improving leadership. You may, in fact, confirm the negative evaluation, and if it's clear up front, that can be perhaps viable, but not necessarily a growth orientation. The other interesting one of the coaches mentioned that she'd actually been hired by the individual, by the leader themselves, because she felt that she had been given there was already a pre-existing assumption that she was not effective from her manager, and she felt that if she could work with the coach could have debriefs with the manager to actually disconfirm his negative evaluation of her and help her to stay in her role and not be blocked for some promotions that she felt were due. So this is an interesting dynamic as well. And again, I think here, not necessarily the best use of a coach. Clearly an agenda-driven method here, not an authentic learning environment. And so you've got to be cautious as a coach, but also cautious as an HR director, talent director, CEO, et cetera, in why are you bringing a coach in and what are you really trying to do with that coach. Now, there are some cases that we can look at, quote unquote, the lost cause. So, we've worked with people where there are extreme outbursts, either by the leader themselves, or I remember one team I was working with where there were extreme outbursts on the team and the leader was not doing anything to nip that in the bud. So those are kinds of things where that's not going to be a productive environment, but a coach can help someone see that. Usually that kind of example is going to come from some sort of observations where they see it live and direct. Loss of confidence, right? So someone feels like they're the lost cause. That can be one where a coach, can really build them up and help them see what their strengths are through assessment, through observation, through reflection. Sometimes someone will be seen as a lost cause because they're not managing up very well. So it comes in as, what can you do to fix this person? They seem like a disaster. And then you go in, you do some assessments, you realize they're actually really effective. They're just not communicating well to their manager and not managing up well. So there are some really interesting cases where this quote unquote lost cause can work, but it often has to do with sort of perceptual situations. And the key theme here is to again be very clear up front about what are the dynamics, what are the expectations that you've got from that individual. So let's kind of put it all together, the bottom line, right, and we kind of promised this in the outcome. What are those situations where you do want to coach? The best uses of the coach are the ones that we talked about here. The knowledge gap being, kind of on the border. The ones that you've got to be cautious and avoid, if you've got a pre-existing point of view and you're trying to confirm, disconfirm, et cetera, that's not necessarily the best use. Sort of a hollow perk for high potentials, you're not going to get a very good return on that. It might feel good to everybody, but you can put your development resources in a much better place, particularly the hollow part of that. If you've got high potentials and you want to support them to really grow and develop, that's great. But if they're just kind of coming in for a feel-good experience, coaching is not a good use of that time. Send them to Hawaii for a management training course. Again, looking at what the true challenge is, whether with the team or elsewhere. And then this one I didn't address directly, but it showed up in multiple different areas and is, I think, a critical one. If the leader themselves does not want to coach, that's probably not going to work, because as you can see, the conversation has to do with it's a two-way conversation. So one of the first things a coach does when they meet with a leader is they ask, what's been going on in the last couple weeks since we talked? What can I help you with? Now they're going to try to overlay the goals of the coaching and the focus of the coaching, but you've got to figure out what's going on currently. And if that leader kind of isn't interested in that conversation, it's not going to work very well. One of my favorite examples of this, and I'll drill in just briefly, but I worked with a leader one time where we sat down, we were going to look at his assessment results, and he just kind of crossed his arms like this. And I said, well, so tell me about your feedback, and what would you like to work on? He got real grumpy like this. And I realized pretty quickly he was not interested in any of this. And he said, well, you just do your thing, whatever it is. And I was in Los Angeles at the time, and I asked him if he was a Dodgers fan and if he'd like to talk about baseball. And he looked at me very quizzically, like, what? And I said, well, I'd rather talk about baseball. I'm a big baseball fan. Rather talk about baseball. If you don't want to talk about your development, then we'll just do that for an hour and we'll move on. And he very quickly, reset and said, okay, actually, no, I am worried about this one thing. So getting through that and making sure that the leader is engaged and wants the coaching, that is job number one. And you can look at that programmatically as, is this a remedial kind of thing or high potentials? But you can also look at it as an individual level and hold some rigor around, does this person want it? Are they pulling for this, or are we pushing it on them? If you're pushing it on them, it's probably not a good idea. So here's some guidelines. And some things to think about as you're trying to figure out what that fit is as a coach or as someone running a coaching program. Contracting is really important in coaching. You've got to be clear, what are the expectations? What are the goals for this? What are we trying to get? What will success look like? Knowing that, having a shared understanding of that is important. And then very critically reporting. Who is it that's going to hear what about this coaching? Is this completely confidential, no report out to anybody? Or is this, or will there be an ongoing conversation with the manager and HR? And if so, what's inbounds and what's out of bounds? Just being clear about that. It can be, as long as everyone knows the rules of engagement, it's fine. It can be every time we talk, there's going to be a detailed report out to your manager. Now that's going to limit the conversation, but at least everyone's clear about what the expectations and goals are. Also important to think about coaches as trusted advisors, not someone who's there just to make you feel good. You're not looking for someone who's, just a cheerleader. Cheerleader can happen. It can be what's really needed, but it should be a lot more than that. Someone's got to be able to push when needed. I would argue that assessments, observation, coaching needs to include some kind of hard data that does not come from the individual themselves. One of the biggest challenges as a leader or as a coach is that you are so dependent upon what that leader says about what's going on and what they need that you can sometimes drift. And so regular assessment and or observation is really, really important. We're pretty disciplined around keeping it at 6-month increments. It's kind of 6 months and then take a pause. It may be that there's a need to continue, but you always want to stop at 6 months and ask the question, what was our goal? How are we doing on that? How will more help? Don't just keep in this you don't want to create a dependency, in other words. You want to create learning that's ongoing. If that learning is ongoing, rich, and beneficial, great. But if not, maybe, I worked with a CEO last year who we got 6 months, and at the end he said, for these 6 months I've gotten so much, but I need to go chew on that for a while. And so sure enough, about 8 months later, he called me back and said, okay, I've chewed on it all. I've made some movement. Let's re-engage. But pause. Make regular pauses in there. Couple of assumptions. Phone coaching is not always or in live coaching is not always better. We've got an interesting paper on when phone coaching can be better. Couple of key advices on getting that coach. Often the experience, this is an experienced coach, right? Teachers are a good example. I put this in my book that you don't want an experienced teacher, you want a good teacher. Now a good teacher with experience, well, that's great. But experience does not necessarily correlate with competency. So you want someone who's really good. And don't assume that demographics matter. It isn't always, gee, we need a male coach for this male person or a female coach for this female person. It could go either way. Demographics are not always the best guide. Level, however, is important. So what I do find is that the conversations I have with a CEO are very different than I have with a first-time supervisor, and understanding, particularly at the C-level, really having had some experience there is important, in particular because of board dynamics. So I would make sure that the leveling is about right. And then I find that industry expertise is not as critical. Again, unless it's that skills-based coaching where you're really trying to get a particular skill set or knowledge, that clearly, some industry expertise is going to be important. But leadership is leadership for the most part, and so you don't want a coach saying, well, here's how we do it in this industry or that. Okay, so I've left some time for questions. And I know we had some from before, but there may have been some that came in as well, Jesse, so I will turn it over to you and let you fire away.
Great, thank you. There were a lot of great questions during registration and during the webinar. One question that I think would be really great to kick it off, a lot of the specific questions were around when someone is or isn't coachable, but I want to start with a question from Bridget, when is coaching not worth the investment?
Right. So when is coaching not worth it? Well, embedded in that is kind of the ROI question, right? And I think that's a key question to be asking, and that goes back to the idea of goals. What are our goals? What are we getting out of this? I think being clear about that is the number one thing when you're looking at kind of return on investment. And I think the real way to look at this is, if coaching, in my mind, coaching is not worth it when the leader themselves are not investing the time to work and to do the work. And so actually it's interesting, one of the differences in our 3D group conversation, where different styles. Some of our coaches are very directive and very specific. We're meeting here, we're meeting here, we're meeting here, and they're pushing it to the leader and making sure that leader is on schedule and meeting with them on a very regular basis. Others are much more hands-off and wanting it to be pulled more from the leader, recognizing that those conversations, though they may be less frequent, are much more rich when they're being pulled. They're going to schedule meetings, but if they're being canceled and that kind of thing, they're really waiting for that leader to pull and ask the question rather than push the question or the topic onto them. So from my perspective, where it's most worth it is when leaders are themselves really engaged, and that engagement is clear, that it's something that they value themselves. If a leader says, this is making a huge difference for me, I really need this, keep resourcing it. If a leader's saying, well, yeah, that was nice, that was kind of interesting, it may not be something you want to do again. I mean, I think you can get value out of those, but not as much. So from my perspective, I would be evaluating ROI from the standpoint of, is the leader getting value out of it themselves? Did they see the value?
Okay, perhaps related to that, another question from Julie. Are there any behaviors or characteristics of a person that indicate that coaching is not going to be effective? And kind of a second part, how to determine a good match between the coach and the coachee?
Yeah, great. So, and to use my example before, interestingly, this behavior, right, would seem to suggest that maybe not a coachable individual, which is was not actually true. So you've got to be a little careful about those initial behaviors and those initial reactions. But in general, that's, I think, what you're looking for, is someone who goes from this to this, right? Someone who's inquisitive and they're asking questions of you. One of the most clear indicators I have every time I work with someone, and I know it's going to be successful, if every time I meet with them, they have their list of questions that they've been thinking about since our last meeting that they want us to explore. In other words, they come with the agenda, not me. If I come with the agenda, it's a passive experience for them, and it's not theirs. So one thing I want to see is I want to see them asking questions, them having the agenda. Gee, I was wondering this. The other one is when I start hearing them say, this thing happened and I knew what you would have said. And now I know that they're really leveraging what we're talking about in a powerful way. There's another simple one, though, that we use a lot, because almost all of our coaching includes some sort of a 360. It's just a perfect way to find out what's going on in the environment and see how ready they are and how they're dealing with feedback and how much they want to improve. And if you look at the self-comments, so 360s ought to have a self-rating and a self-comment. It means something very different if the leader does not fill out the self-comment, as in I don't have anything to improve, I don't have strengths, or they fill it out in a way that is third party. So occasionally you'll read those comments and it'll say, he's really fantastic at everything. And it's third person. It's like it's your comment, and it says it's separated out by group. So I could see that you said if they put it in the first person, it's all often better. But also just the content of the comments, their ability to self-reflect and see what do I need to grow, what do I need to work on. That is absolutely critical. So yeah, those are kind of some key upfront behaviors that I would look for. And was there a second part, or did I get that?
Yeah, the second part was how to determine the match between the coach and the coachee. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, interestingly, we all kind of agreed on this one that you need to find something about the person you're coaching that you like. You need to be able to kind of root for their success on some level. So as a coach, trying to figure out where that fit is, that's something I'm always paying attention to is, well, what am I rooting for this person? Do I want them? And occasionally you run into people where you think, wow, this person is just not somebody I want to succeed. And if that's true, boy, you need to really be honest with yourself and run from that and try to find a referral, because it's an individual difference thing. So other things, though, in terms of fit, I think, one thing you've got to be a little careful about, I've seen people use kind of like, gee, what was your favorite movie? Or, try to like get to know the coach as a person to try to find a fit where the leader's trying to find. I just don't think that works. I think you're not there to be buddies. You're there to help them be effective in their job. And so I think the best way is a little bit of a trial, a little bit of early on, even if you've contracted for a 6-month engagement, do an assessment, have a debrief, check in, and then ask the question, how's it going? Do you feel good about this? So I think there are a few things that you can do in terms of just understanding, the person's experience, but a lot of it is really just once you meet, trying to get a feel for, are we working well together and whatnot, yeah.
So related to the idea of choosing a coach, Jess asked, what are your thoughts on internal coaches versus external, and which situation is preferable in different situations?
So as an external coach, you would expect my bias to be very strong here, but it's not necessarily. I mean, it's got to be what works best. So internal coaches can be very effective, particularly when there is a coaching program internally where there's some kind of certification. There's somebody running that program that's really making sure that the coaches are professional coaches. Where I see internal coaching go wrong is when it's used as a way to kind of level up HR business partners who are wanting to be less transactional and more transformative in their effect on the organization, and they don't have the skills. Now, it's not that they can't all do that. Some of them probably do have the skills individually, but to try to create a program where you're trying to get everybody to be equal and, well, all the HR managers are going to pick this up. Well, it might only be 20% that really have the skills and the capabilities to do that. And in either case, you want to make sure those folks are really trained up. I mean, it takes years of this kind of work to do this well. So you got to be careful on the skill set. The other thing is that internally, we were doing work with one global company where HR was very, very powerful, and they're just internally in terms of their dynamic and their ability to influence decisions within the organization. Frontline business even was not as strong as HR in terms of their ability to affect an outcome. And their HR people could never coach. There is no way they would be successful because they just weren't trusted. It would be assumed by leaders that HR person was making personnel decisions based on that confidential conversation. So there are things that you can explore as an external that you can't explore as an internal. So it also depends a little bit on who and what. And you want to be careful as HR that you want to be able to be neutral. And if you're in there and you find yourself rooting for that leader, and then all of a sudden something changes in the organization, and you need to be that neutral arbiter. So it can be done, but it's just trickier. The dynamics are trickier, and you want to be really, really clear and upfront about who your internal coaches are and how they're used.
So while we're talking about roles, we had one question: how do coaches typically work with leaders, bosses, and HR?
Yeah, that's really important. I've had plenty of successful engagements where the boss was not involved, but when there's any kind of accountability, accountability just raises the stakes quite a bit in a very positive way. If the individual's truly engaged and they're just, I really want this, and there's a kind of built-in accountability, right? If they're really trying to learn, you don't need, it's kind of like the student that's, reading the book and taking notes and going to the lectures, and the test is kind of an afterthought, right? So you don't necessarily need that, but in most cases you want that manager to be involved. And a big part of that is that the manager is there every day, and the manager knowing that the person is working on whatever they're working on, they can provide a critical support. And also coaching, if it's done right, and there's a feedback loop every month or two with the manager, coaching can really help build the relationship between the manager and the coachee by them kind of understanding each other and helping to kind of work on those issues, in which case you strengthen that relationship, and that's ultimately what you're trying to do, is to build capacity for the organization. So by doing that, you may actually, in a sense, you work your way out of a coaching engagement, but that's good because they're doing the work and moving the person forward.
Great. I think we have about 2 more questions, and we should have time for those. Linda asked, how important is it for a small team of executives to collectively embrace executive coaching when it's being offered? In her organization, it was offered to 3 people. The person who needed it most declined, and the other 2 dropped out before coaching was finished. And she wants to know how you'd avoid a failure like this when management isn't interested in addressing their personal development and leadership style.
So here's where you just need to be clear about what your goal for the coaching is and be able to go back to them and say, hey, you're not succeeding in this way, and we've made a resource for you available to try to address that, and you declined it. So what are you going to do to address that issue? Maybe it's being overly confrontational with peers or something like that, and it's like, hey, this is a problem, and we've got a resource here, and you declined it. So you don't get to decline the problem. The problem is real. Let's find a way to solve that problem. And if it's not coaching, fine, let's do something else. But really you've got to get them accountable for whatever the problem is that coaching was there to try to address. So focus on the problem, and then hopefully the coaching they'll see coaching as a resource. But yeah, you got to get them to see the need. Feel the pain, if you will. If they don't feel the pain, then they're not going to want to try to fix it.
So we have one final question. I think I know what you're going to say about this one. Lisa wanted to know if you advise conducting 360 reviews for individuals before the management team has been reviewed by a coach.
Yeah, well, yes. You predicted that one well, yeah. I just think 360s are such a critical thing it's a unique tool for getting the feedback from the environment about what's going on, right? So even a personality assessment is still self-report. It's about them and their person, but knowing the dynamic and knowing the feedback, I mean, you could even do, if not a 360 review, then at least do interviews, and I differentiate those. Interviews are very valuable, but individual interviews with the team can be a great way to kind of find out what's going on as well. It's more time-consuming, more costly. It delays things a little bit as compared to a 360, but it can be very, very effective as well. I love what Marshall Goldsmith does with this, where he says, hey, give me what that thing is that you want this person to change, and then he goes back to the person and says, they all say they want you to change this. That's a great way to use an interview-based method, but the 360 can be very efficient to do that, and it's nice because it's a broader set. You can get a lot more people, not just focus on a narrow group. And so I would say getting some feedback from the environment, 360 is a great way to do it, but some feedback from the environment. Don't just rely on the individual for all of your data. Yeah, that's important.
Great. Well, thank you, Dale, and thank you, everyone, for your great questions. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us at 510-463-0333, and please visit our website. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.